When someone loses weight or when a home is being remodeled, very often we are curious about seeing before and after pictures. But I've also always been kind of curious, is there another phase or another picture that you'd want to see? And that is maybe a year after the weight loss, or 5 years, or after the remodeling is done and the kitchen looks beautiful. The after picture is perfect, but after you've lived in it for a year, the mail kind of starts piling up on the counter. There's a few spills, the grout begins to get dirty. Suddenly it's not quite as pristine as it was intended. So there's almost like 3 phases. There's before, after, and after that. And that's really what our readings and our faith brings us to today. We're directed towards looking at what did God intend before, what happened after, and what happened inevitably after that. You see, the before is that time period where God created the world. You know, it's just 2 small chapters in Genesis where we hear about an incredible tranquility, a beautiful peace that reigned over all creation. There was order, and there was certainly that ability for God to look down upon all of his creation and to be pleased because he saw that all of it was good. That's just 2 chapters in Genesis. So from chapter 3 in Genesis all the way through the Old Testament, we have an after, because it was in chapter 3 when the fall occurred, when sin entered the world. And suddenly there was a shattering of that beautiful picture and portrait that God had intended. Before the fall, everything was perfect. After, there was darkness. I'm reminded of a stained glass window. When you look at stained glass windows, you realize that you're seeing a beautiful image. And each one of the windows tells a story or represents someone or something. When it's all together and God's light shines through and it's beautiful. If you look at this particular window, it's made of over 3,000 pieces of glass. And each piece of glass individually has a beauty to it, has a shine, a luster. But when it's put together, it tells that story. So the story is what God intended for each one of us, beautifully put together and arranged. But once sin entered the world through Adam and Eve, our ancestors, suddenly there were all these broken pieces. And even though each one had beauty, and even though there was a lot of similarity between them, there were broken and jagged edges to them. And those broken and jagged edges came in the form of ambition, came in the form of power, came in the form of indulgence, came in the form of pride, came in the form of putting too much emphasis on pleasure and hedonism. And so after the fall, and in the whole course of history of the Old Testament, the people were waiting. They were hoping, and God sent prophets into the world. And he said, I want to love you. It's when this wisdom reading was written, probably about a century or so before the time of Christ, when we hear that God did not intend death to come into the world. God did not want us to be perishable. See, the soul is imperishable. And so wisdom gives us that ability to look ahead, to look forward, to see what did God intend before, so we don't get dragged down into darkness, so we don't allow those sharp edges that come because of sin to make cuts and destroy a kingdom and a world that could be perfect, that could be beautiful in God's eyes. And so that window that God intended is now shattered until the time of Christ. And Christ came to restore. Christ came to make all things new once again. So our gospel reading today brings us to a beautiful place in Mark's gospel, talking about healing. 2 separate stories where people were broken. There was brokenness because a child died. There was brokenness because there was physical suffering. Those are just 2 examples of brokenness, but there can be a lot more brokenness that occurs in our lives. In this gospel, we see how Jesus comes there to the town and the people reach out. One was rather assertive, going up to Jesus, "My daughter has died, can you help me?" The woman who was very bold, who reached out and touched the cloak of Jesus, and he said, "Who touched me?" You see, for her, she took a huge risk in that brokenness, but she was desperate. And she reached out to Jesus, which was against the laws of purity. She could have been arrested, her life could have been taken away, but she knew something great was there with Christ. And she saw that after. She was able to see that something comes after brokenness, and that is healing. So she reaches out, and Jesus helps her. Brokenness is a part of our life. Henry Nouwen, who was a great spiritual writer, he died about 20 years ago. He wrote in one of his blogs and one of his books, he said that our lives are full of brokenness. Whether it be broken expectations, broken relationships, broken promises. But how is it that we live with that brokenness and not allow it to come to resentment and bitterness? The only way to do that is to again and again realize that God's faithful presence in our lives, God's faithful presence in our lives can overcome brokenness, neediness, desperateness. God's faithful presence can bring healing to all situations, so that the window, which is beautiful, suddenly is now put back together after being shattered. That's the power of Christ, because death is no more. Sadness can be no more. There's hope for a future. There's hope for resurrection. That's what God intends. That's what He wants from us. But we have to allow His grace to come into our hearts. You see, when we have brokenness in our lives, challenges and suffering, we have to empty ourselves in order to become full once again. It is when we take our pains, our sufferings, our emotions, our difficulties, whatever's going on in our lives, and bring them to God, to stand transparent before a God who loves us, to be alone with the one who is alone in the gift of greatness in the kingdom of heaven. Then and only then can we find that gift of healing. I tell you that from a personal aspect, because I realized it was about a year ago or so that my brother passed away. And then Monsignor passed away. It was a really challenging time, I have to say that. And I personally felt a sense of, wow, God, what else is going to happen? And how are we put things back together? But it was for me personally that going to the Lord through the gift of prayer, through the gift of transparency, through the gift of asking the question, God, why? When we go to God and we ask that question, we just might get answers if we are listening. Because we realize when we empty ourselves of our brokenness and suffering, we can be filled with the beauty of His grace and the hope for what lies ahead. Today, as we hear these readings, today, as we can concentrate and think of our own brokenness, whether it be small, whether it be big, bring it to God. Ask for His help. Yell at Him if you have to. Talk to Him in a way of whatever is in your own heart, because He sent His Son into the world to be human so that we could have a human being to talk to be able to see God in the flesh. And who else knew what brokenness was than our brother, Jesus Christ? Who else would have known what suffering was except Him who had nails in His hands and His feet, a sword through His side? But He didn't let it get Him down. He overcame it. He was able to have hope for the future, and He rose from it. God wants the same for us. To take whatever is on our minds, challenges, difficulties, and brokenness, and to give it to Him. So that then maybe we can see a before, we can see an after, but when God is involved, it's after that. And after that is when there is healing, not just for a short period of time, But with God, his healing is for all eternity.